Hello again. In this final segment of our presentation for Politics of Southeast Europe, um, the general topic I'd like to talk about is privatization and new classes, but this is an issue that is addressed in detail in the readings, that's going to be addressed by the presentations that we have in the seminar, that we're also going to be revisiting later on in the term when we talk about political culture and protest. Um, so rather than moving into detail on privatization and new classes at the moment, we'll do that in discussion. What I want to do is to provide some background that is going to help in making sense of it. And the first thing that I want to talk about is the formation of new classes. And in doing that, I'm going to move to some material that might not seem at first sight to be directly applicable to Southeast Europe. And that is a set of findings from the classic study by Diego Gambetta in 1993 of the Sicilian Mafia. He talks about the formation of the Sicilian Mafia, and one of the questions he asks is, what are the conditions that give rise to the emergence of mafias? That is, to illegal and extra-legal organizations which have the peculiar concern of being involved in the creation and enforcement of contracts. And for Gambetta, there are four elements that are essential for the formation of a mafia. And one of the things that's interesting about his observations is that none of these conditions have to do with isolation or poverty. In fact, just the opposite. The first of those conditions is that there is an increase in economic activity, so not a stable condition of poverty, but in particular, an increase in the number of transactions taking place. This is related to development, and it's related to intensification of relations between cities and rural areas. And this is probably one of the things that is important about the number of transactions um, uh, that are increasing, is that these transactions take place among people who do not have relations of trust with one another, who believe that they are likely to be cheated. So this increasing number of transactions takes place in an atmosphere of distrust. And this atmosphere of distrust is compounded by the third element that you see on the list. That is, an environment in which legal and political authority are weak, in which the state has not fully established its ability to declare and to enforce laws and to maintain order. So there is a search that goes on for other forces that are going to maintain order, and in particular to enforce agreements that are made in these transactions. And who is available to do it? A group of people who are trained in the use of violence and who are not subordinate to another force, in particular not subordinate to a legally constituted force that uses violence, a force like the military or the police. Now, all of this applies very well to the mid-19th century in Sicily, the period when mafias emerge in Gambetta's account. This is a period of rapid urbanization and development, and the government of the Republic of Italy had taken control, legal control, over the territory of Sicily, but encountered resistance, was not able to establish control completely, did not really establish complete control until the latter half of the 20th century. And in the meantime, there were all of these forces who were employed as security by the previous landowners and power holders in Sicily, who were out of work when these landowners and power holders left, and so they became available to be this force that developed eventually into what we know of now as a mafia. Now, one of the things that this tells us is that the structure of economic and institutional activity is going to depend on the ways in which the classes of people engaged in that activity are formed. And this is also the case in post-regime and post-conflict environments. So one application of Gambetta's ideas we can see in an analogous study a bit more recently by Peter Andreas, he's talking about the origin and consolidation of new elites in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And he says what eventually becomes the dominant economic and political class in Bosnia and Herzegovina is the group that was able to profit from the breakdown of institutions during the period of violence. Um, these are Some of them are violent criminal groups, some of them are non-violent criminal groups engaged in activities like smuggling. But the successful ones among them come to form the core of the community of dominant, economically active people in the society, with implications for the way that economic practices develop in the community and for the ways that politics are practiced, in particular for the relation between political and economic activity. So there are processes in which groups form into a class with interests of its own. Sometimes these processes are illegitimate processes, and what generally follows then is um, is a set of events in which the members of the emergent dominant class, principally by association with political elites, make an effort to legitimize their power. And in that sense, we can talk about some other dimensions of what we can think of as the formation of new or possibly not new classes in Southeast Europe. First, we can look at the formation of classes in the period after 2000 as a process basically of continuity, that is, one in which people who had influential and powerful positions under the system of state socialism were able to transform those into other dominant and powerful positions in the post-socialist system. So, for example, the class of people who had been the managerial class under socialism, people who were managers of industries, managed to become, in many instances, the owners of the industries that they manage to consolidate their position. A similar thing can be said for some, but not for all professions. That is, in the construction of classes in the post-2000 period, there are elements of continuity, but there are also elements of discontinuity. Looking at the second point on this slide here, and this is something that is reflected in the history of the region of Southeast Europe repeatedly over the last 2 centuries because of frequent changes of political regime, because of frequent changes in the ways in which political regimes are legitimated and justify their power. New classes have been formed, have failed to consolidate, and have been replaced by newer classes several times over this period. And it's possible to look at the emergence and consolidation of what is presently the dominant class in terms of this ongoing and repeated process. A third thing that we can say about changes in class structure and in social structure in the period after 2000 is that inequality has tended to become more rigid, in the sense that with deindustrialization that is happening generally in Europe and in other parts of the world that were previously industrial, and with the growing marginalization of the region of Southeast Europe, the groups that are shrinking the most are the working class, a relatively powerful and influential group in the period of state socialism, and the middle class, a group of people able to lead lives based on knowledge, expertise, and technical ability, and whose fates did not depend directly on the involvement of the state. What you see increasing are groups of people who are disenfranchised, that is, who are not represented, who are relatively powerless within the system, and groups of people who are tremendously franchised, that is, enfranchised, that is, who are beneficiaries of the system and come to form the core of this political and economic elite whose members are very closely tied to one another. But all of this talk about class becomes a little bit more difficult when you're talking about an environment like Southeast Europe, because in comparison to other parts of Europe, to the so-called established capitalist economies, the levels of inequality in Southeast Europe are not generally all that high. The ratio between the highest income, the average income of the highest group, and the average income of the lowest group in most of the Southeast European states is somewhere 6 to 1, 7 to 1, 8 to 1, so very much unlike more established capitalist economies in Europe where this ratio is closer to 20 to 1 or 30 to 1, very, very high. Differences in economic capital, if we're talking about distinctions in income and distinctions in property, particularly if you exclude the very wealthiest and the very poorest groups, are relatively low. We're talking about people with newer as opposed to older cars, with larger as opposed to smaller residential spaces, and so on. Differences in economic capital, one of the three forms of capital, as it's proposed by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, are relatively small compared to some other parts of the capitalist world. And what this means is that differences in the other forms of capital that Bourdieu talks about, differences in social capital, that is the ability to call upon people from your network of friends and acquaintances and relatives to help you solve problems, and differences in cultural capital, that is the ability to draw upon your taste and education and all of the things that make you recognized as belonging to the dominant group in order to affirm privilege. These become relatively more important in the environment of Southeast Europe than they are in other parts of Europe. And what this means then is that social networks are more important in this part of the world than they are in other parts of the world, and differences in taste and honor and respect, all of these distinctions that are expressed through things like appearance, also become much more important. This is as much as I'm going to say about class and changes in class in the region for this week. This leaves open a number of questions that I hope we'll be able to pursue in our discussion.